Hey everyone, Pugs here with two new reviews for y'all. And today I'm covering Graveyard Shift and Krusty Love, which are two very iconic episodes for two very different reasons. So I'm excited to get into it. And as always, just want to extend a quick thank you to everyone who's been watching, liking, commenting. Y'all know the drill. And yeah, with all of that said, I think we can get right into these episodes. Yes, simply yes. That's all I can really say. Graveyard Shift is simply an amazing episode. And spoiler alert, it's my favorite episode of season 2. So let's discuss. From just the literal title card of this episode, Graveyard Shift is a very atmospheric 11 minutes, and I love that, as I'm sure y'all know by now. The art team really knocked it out of the park with the backgrounds in this episode. They're so dark and eerie and add to the feeling of working at a restaurant at 3 a.m. The music choices in this episode were also excellent, which is of course not surprising as music is one of SpongeBob SquarePants' strong suits. And getting into the content of this episode, let me just say that as someone who has worked in a restaurant, Graveyard Shift is extremely relatable and gives me a tremendous amount of enjoyment, from the dumb customers to the inconsiderate boss. And throughout the beginning of this episode, I feel Squidward on a spiritual level. Speaking of the beginning of Graveyard Shift, we see my boy Tom here, which is great, and this whole beginning setup is very funny and very believable that Mr. Krabs would do this to employees for money. Despite feeling Squidward's annoyance, you can't help, or at least I can't help but, be endeared to SpongeBob's enthusiasm about working the night shift. He's really just so adorable in this episode in a way that harkens back to some of the best of season 1. Mr. Krabs' repetition of Squidward's earlier sentiment is just perfect, making for a great exit for the crustacean from this episode. I also love the entire sequence of SpongeBob taking out the trash, because that's exactly what it was like at the job I worked at last summer, where we had to take out the trash at midnight. And this scene is also hilarious and visually stunning, which again just shows how fantastic the atmosphere is in this episode. We don't usually get night shots like this either, so I'm enjoying what we do see as much as I can. This episode feels very realistic in how it plays out. Squidward, out of boredom and annoyance at his coworker, decides to mess with SpongeBob by telling him a scary story. This is definitely something I would do, not gonna lie, and having worked late nights before, we've definitely done shit like this, including deep cleans like SpongeBob does later in the episode too. Really, this episode feels like a love letter to all of us night shift employees out there. I'm taking it that way, at least. And speaking of scary stories, the story of the hash-slinging slasher is immensely entertaining, helped by SpongeBob's reactions throughout it, which make for some great visuals. I'm thinking of him like eating his hands like popcorn, like that was a funny gag. In the end, SpongeBob screaming and then laughing aren't even annoying at all, which is a great relief because sometimes these moments can get real annoying real fast. I've really got lots to say about this episode, so let me zoom through a little bit. I enjoy pretty much everything else in this episode, to be honest. The atmosphere once again as Squidward gets more and more nervous, the random 3 a.m. cutaway gag, which I now can't watch without thinking of the YouTube Poop Deliver Us, which I will be linking, of course, and then the build-up to the hash-slinging slasher. The joint screaming scenes of SpongeBob and Squidward are amazingly animated and are hilarious, and I love the bit where Squidward and SpongeBob have their pre-perceived death confessions. It's just too funny. And then, of course, the tension is evaporated once the quote-unquote hash-slinging slasher is revealed to be a kid with a great design, by the way. I like that SpongeBob immediately forgot about everything and went straight to asking the kid if he had references. That's SpongeBob for you. Why that kid decided to show up at the Krusty Krab at 3 a.m. to apply for a job, I have no idea. I choose to believe that after this episode, the kid worked the night shift until Mr. Krabs decided to turn the Krusty Krab back to normal hours. Or who knows, maybe he started to work at the night patty. And then, of course, we have the iconic ending of Graveyard Shift, a complete non sequitur that just works. That the new kid gets on it too is perfect as well. And I love that Nosferatu has apparently returned in a modern episode that I still need to watch. I just love all the callbacks that writers have been making lately. I know some people complain that they put too many Easter eggs and references, but I really don't care. So, yeah. One thing that puts this episode above one like Squidward's Day Off, which is another episode I really enjoy from this season, is that the great character dynamics are on full swing here. Squidward and SpongeBob drive the plot, but Mr. Krabs is there as well at the beginning, and because SpongeBob SquarePants had been going on for long enough by this point, we know what everyone's dynamic is like. That knowledge helps lay the foundations for this episode, in my opinion. We can enjoy Mr. Krabs' appearance more because we already know that he has a friendly relationship with SpongeBob and Squidward. I don't know if I'm making myself very clear here, but I also don't know how to better explain what I mean, so I'll just go ahead and move on to the little summary. Graveyard Shift is one of the most recognizable episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants, and much like Band Geeks, I believe this episode absolutely deserves this. The number of SpongeBob horror games using concepts from this episode alone is enough to cement its icon status. But in all seriousness, this episode is amazingly crafted, atmospheric, hilarious, and fun. And it's one of my favorites of season 2, if not the entire show. And it's a perfect addition to my amazing tier, where it will come in with a score of 9.6 out of 10. Next up, we've got quite the fun little episode in Krusty Love. This episode is pretty good, and I love how it pairs together two characters that just work great together, Mrs. Puff and Mr. Krabs. I love how modern episodes are bringing back Mr. Krabs' and Mrs. Puff's relationship, because I absolutely adore them in this episode. I like how Krusty Love starts with Mr. Krabs being extremely dramatic, because I love when he gets dramatic like this. And let me just say right now that you might want to remember this whenever I get to clams. Anyway, his dramatics are so funny, and his eyes make it very easy to animate these dramatics interestingly. And the drama gets turned up to another level once he spots Mrs. Puff, and it's funny watching him flounder at trying to even talk to the woman, even if this joke does go on a teensy bit too long. Hey, at least SpongeBob is the best wingman ever. I'ma just say that. I love that the conflict in this episode is that Mr. Krabs is so infatuated that he can't help but spend money on Mrs. Puff. This is kind of a constant for his character, that he's most willing to spend money when it's on someone he loves or cares about, like Pearl. So I appreciate that we're kind of seeing the beginnings of that here, given that we haven't really seen any kind of spending from Mr. Krabs this far. And also, I think it adds a dimension of likability to Mr. Krabs. Not that he's unlikable in any way to me, but greed is, of course, a bad attribute, so by adding this little bit to his character, he garners more sympathy. Even though I love him when he's a conniving skinflint too, so it's always a win for me, basically, is what I'm saying. The main problem with this episode, though, is that it kind of slogs a bit, with some great bits in between. For example, the date between Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff is a bit dull until we get to the bill. And man, imagine if Mr. Krabs had just kept his mouth shut, he'd be much happier. Thank God Mr. Krabs is such a cheapskate and the owner of a successful restaurant, because imagine getting charged $100,000 in one night. God, that's so much money. His reaction to the new bill really makes that whole scene too. And the episode again drags until we get to the quick montage of SpongeBob having to put up with Mr. Krabs' shit. It's fun to see the build up to one of my favorite parts of the episode, but it does drag on a bit, and it isn't very funny until SpongeBob does snap. And speaking of, here we come to that last bit of the episode. Y'all know I love when SpongeBob goes off, and boy does he hear. It's hilarious, it's over the top, it's perfection. The fact that someone used it to make a rant about Among Us makes it even better in my opinion. It's an excellent way to close off the episode, especially once we see Mr. Krabs' reaction. I also really love the actual ending of the episode because it's so darn cute. Mr. Krabs' little heart eyes thing is absolutely adorable, and I love that they didn't end with there being no hope for the Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff relationship, which is why, 15, 20 years later, we're able to see them together. Krusty Love is a cute, fun episode. It's pretty good, although it does have some issues with becoming dull more than once. When I'm in the mood, it's a nice rewatch. When I'm not, it's a skip. So this episode sits comfortably in my good tier, coming in with a score of 7.6 out of 10. As always, just wanted to end with some closing thoughts of mine, and honestly, I don't really have very many. One thing I was thinking of during this whole time while recording is how I've basically just done 3 iconic episodes in a row, maybe even 4 if you count how the ending of The Secret Box is pretty iconic. So I guess that really shows how season 2 is one of the most iconic seasons. I mean really the first 3 seasons, just because, of course it's quote-unquote classic SpongeBob and blah blah blah, and modern hate this and modern that and blah blah blah, but you know how it is. But I don't know, that's just something I was thinking about while recording. And another thing I was thinking about is how, like, I'm actually getting kind of close to the end of this season, which is, like, crazy, because, like, it feels like I just started, and that means I'm gonna have to, like, get ready with a whole new other, tier list, and oh my god, and at least it's summer, so it'll be a little easier, hopefully. I've actually had a harder time recording than I did during the school year, but that's for a lot of reasons, so I'm still getting them done, though. And yeah, I guess that's everything I really have to say because this got really rambly really quickly. So let me just go ahead and end it now. And I will see you guys in the next review.